For years, I believed that love meant never allowing your heart to wander, never letting loneliness take root, and never admitting that something inside you felt incomplete. I had grown up believing that marriage was sacred, that once you chose someone, you chose them every single day, without hesitation. When I married Hassan, I truly meant every vow. He was gentle, responsible, and hardworking. He carried the weight of our future on his shoulders without complaint. Our early years were simple but beautiful. We laughed over burnt dinners, shared quiet prayers before bed, and dreamed about the children we hoped to have. I never imagined there would come a time when I would sit in my living room, my husband asleep upstairs, and feel as though I had betrayed something far greater than just a promise. Life has a quiet way of changing without announcing itself. Hassan started working longer hours after he received a promotion. I was proud of him, proud that his dedication was being recognized, but pride does not warm an empty bed or fill a silent dinner table. Night after night, I would wait for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. Sometimes he would come home too exhausted to speak. Sometimes he would fall asleep before finishing his meal. I told myself this was temporary, that sacrifices were necessary for stability. I reminded myself that love meant patience. Still, something inside me began to ache, not because he was unfaithful, but because life felt like it was slowly separating us. When our twin daughters were born, my world shifted again. They became my purpose, my joy, and my constant companions. Their laughter filled the house that had once echoed with silence. Yet motherhood also brought exhaustion, uncertainty, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Hassan tried to help when he could, but his career demanded more and more from him. I found myself craving conversation, adult interaction, someone to remind me that I was more than just a tired mother folding laundry at midnight. I never wanted attention from another man. What I wanted was to feel seen, valued, and heard. The community center near our home began hosting weekly parenting workshops. I attended at first just to learn how to better manage the twins' endless energy. That was where I met the group that would unknowingly change my understanding of loyalty and emotional boundaries. There were other mothers and a few fathers, all navigating the same sleepless nights and endless responsibilities. We shared stories, frustrations, and laughter. For the first time in months, I felt understood. Among them was Semina, a widowed mother of one, who carried both strength and sorrow in her eyes. She and I became close quickly. She would listen without judgment, and I found myself confiding in her about how distant Hassan and I had become. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I stayed late at the center helping prepare decorations for a children's event. My phone buzzed with a message from Hassan saying he would be working overnight to meet a deadline. I stared at the message longer than I should have. I was disappointed but not surprised. The others were still there, laughing and planning. Semina squeezed my hand and said, "You deserve a little time for yourself." That night, while my husband slept in his office upstairs at work, I stayed with them at the center, sharing stories, sipping tea, and allowing myself to feel part of something again. It sounds innocent when described that way, and perhaps in many ways it was. There was no physical betrayal, no secret touches, no whispered promises. But as I sat there, laughing freely while Hassan believed I was home resting, a heavy realization began to settle in my heart. Emotional distance can be just as dangerous as physical temptation. I had begun to seek comfort, understanding, and connection outside my marriage instead of fighting to rebuild it within. While my husband was asleep upstairs in his office, exhausted from working for our future, I was pouring my loneliness into conversations that should have belonged to him. Over the following weeks, I noticed myself looking forward to the gatherings more than I looked forward to Hassan's return home. That frightened me. I started dressing a little more carefully for those evenings, applying lipstick I hadn't worn in months. Not for anyone in particular, but because I felt alive again. Yet each time I glanced at my wedding ring, guilt pricked at my conscience. There was nothing inappropriate happening, yet something inside me whispered that I was crossing an invisible line. Emotional infidelity does not announce itself with dramatic music or scandal. It begins quietly, with small justifications and unmet needs. One night, I returned home earlier than usual. The house was dark except for the faint light upstairs. Hassan had come home unexpectedly and fallen asleep on our bed, still wearing his work clothes. I stood in the doorway watching him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face looked thinner than I remembered. In that moment, I saw not a distant husband, but a man silently sacrificing his health for us. My chest tightened with shame. I realized that while I had been counting what I was missing, I had not once counted what he was carrying. I went downstairs and sat alone in the living room. The laughter from earlier that evening echoed in my mind, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt misplaced. I asked myself a painful question. Had I tried hard enough to tell Hassan how lonely I felt? Or had I simply retreated into silence, expecting him to read emotions I never expressed? Marriage is not just about loyalty in actions. It is about honesty in feelings. I had been loyal in body, but distant in heart. The next morning, I made a decision that terrified me more than any secret ever could. I asked Hassan to take the day off. He looked surprised, even worried. We sat at our kitchen table after sending the girls to my mother's house. For the first time in months, we spoke without distraction. I told him everything, not about betrayal, because there had been none in the physical sense, but about my loneliness, my feelings of invisibility, and my fear that we were becoming strangers. Tears fell freely, not from anger, but from release. Hassan listened quietly. When I finished, he lowered his head and admitted that he had been afraid too, afraid of failing us financially, afraid of not being enough, afraid that if he slowed down, everything would collapse. He thought he was protecting us by working harder, never realizing that in doing so, he was losing the very connection he was trying to secure. That conversation lasted hours. It was uncomfortable, raw, and honest. Yet it was also the most intimate moment we had shared in years. I told him about the community center and the friends I had made. I told him how much those evenings meant to me. I expected jealousy or anger, but instead he said something that changed me. "I'm glad you found support. I just wish I had been the one you felt safe running to first." His words were not accusatory. They were tender, and that tenderness pierced deeper than any accusation could have. From that day forward, we began rebuilding, not through grand gestures but through small, consistent efforts. Hassan reduced his overtime hours. I became more mindful of creating space for us, not just as parents, but as partners. We started having tea together after the girls slept, even if only for 15 minutes. We prayed side by side again. We listened more and assumed less. I continued attending the workshops, but with clearer boundaries and a renewed sense of responsibility to my marriage. Looking back, I understand now that true infidelity is not always about physical betrayal. Sometimes it is about where you allow your heart to seek refuge. While my husband was asleep upstairs, I was with them, but what I truly needed was to wake up emotionally and return to the man who had chosen me and whom I had chosen in return. Love is not the absence of loneliness, it is the willingness to confront loneliness together. Years later, when our daughters ask us about the secret to a strong marriage, I do not tell them that we never struggled. I tell them that we almost drifted apart because we stopped speaking honestly. I tell them that love requires courage, humility, and forgiveness. Most importantly, I tell them that when you feel unseen, you must speak before silence builds walls too high to climb. The night I stood in the doorway watching Hassan sleep remains etched in my memory. It was the night I realized that loyalty is not just about staying, it is about staying present. Marriage is not sustained by vows spoken once, but by choices made daily. I chose to return emotionally to my husband, and he chose to make space for my heart again. Together, we learned that challenges are not signs of failure, but invitations to grow deeper. If there is one truth my story carries, it is this: guard your heart with honesty. Do not let unspoken pain push you toward connections that only temporarily soothe. Speak, even when your voice trembles. Listen, even when it is uncomfortable. Because love, when nurtured with patience and respect, can survive misunderstandings, exhaustion, and even the quiet temptation of emotional escape. And sometimes, the greatest act of faithfulness is not resisting another person. It is choosing, again and again, to turn back toward the one who is already yours.